moment there's wind, I want to pack up my things and head back south. And then I remember that that's terrible in the summer, so then I dig deep and I stay. Awesome. My name is Andrea Strohmeyer, if I have not met you before. I am the education, what do I do here? Education Programs Manager at the Door County Maritime Museum. Big thank you right quick to our sponsors, the Door County Medical Center and Bridgeport Resort. It feels like today is day number 735 of your standard 5-day work day or 5-day work week. Anyway, so if you're here for funsies, I do highly recommend Bridgeport. They're great people. If you're not here for funsies, and that's a bummer, you will not get better medical care than at Door County Medical Center. I do like those people. They really have helped me out a lot of times. Tonight's speaker, we have Mr. Brennan Christianson. Brennan is staff here at Door County Maritime Museum. He is in charge of all of the collections. So all of the items that you see on display that look old or like somebody has built it, that is Brennan's purview here. Brennan is a really smart guy. He knows a lot about a lot of stuff. And I'm going to let him tell you about the Lakeland tonight. Yay, Brennan.
Hello there. Hi, as Andrea said, my name is Brennan Christianson. I am the collections coordinator of the Door County Maritime Museum and Lighthouse Preservation Society Incorporated. I know, mouthful. DCMM for short. Today I'm here to talk to you about the Lakeland, its beginnings, its fateful sinking, and the 2 lawsuits that followed it. The entire presentation should take about 45 minutes, so please leave any questions that you may have until the very end. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have at that time. Ooh. Okay. December 3rd, 1924, dawn. The Lakeland, a 37-year-old auto ferry, leaves Sturgeon Bay for Detroit, Michigan. This being its last passage of the season, the vessel is carrying rather light, with only about 50 cards in its hold. After an hour in the open water, crewmen start to notice a leak in the vessel's hull. The vessel begins to list to port, or to the left side. So the captain orders that the vessel turns back around and head back towards Sturgeon Bay. The Lakeland sounds its whistle 4 times. This is a common distress call. 2 vessels, the Cygnus and the Ann Arbor No. 6, come to the vessel's rescue, and the Coast Guard vessel from the local station at the canal follows soon afterwards. As the vessel heads towards Sturgeon Bay and sees the Cygnus in the distance, instead of heading back to Sturgeon Bay, it turns back around again into open water and heads towards the Cygnus instead. When the Cygnus arrives, the Lakeland drops its anchor, and the crew started to abandon ship. The captain was the last member of the crew to abandon said ship and remained at its side as it slowly began to sink. The crew was safely aboard the Ann Arbor No. 6, and both vessels offered to tow the Lakeland back to shore, but the captain refused. 15 minutes prior to its sinking, the captain finally rows away and allows the vessel to sink slowly into the bottom of Lake Michigan. Thompson Transit Company, the owner of the Lakeland, was now able to collect $350,000 for the insurance covering the vessel 1 week before it expired. So how do we get to this point? I know I like to start off things with a very dramatic middle point and then go back to the beginning and go to the end. I learned that from Hollywood. Anyways. So how do we get here? Okay, so the Lakeland of the Thompson Transit Company wasn't always this. 37 years prior to this, it was known as the Cambria of the Mutual Transit Corporation. I believe that's a picture of it before it was the Lakeland. The Cambria was constructed as a bulk freighter, meaning it shipped bulk supplies, coal and wood and foodstuffs, built at Globe Iron Works of Cleveland, Ohio in 1887. The vessel at the time was 280 feet long. For comparison, if you look out to your right, the John Purvis is about 149 feet long, so it's just under 2 John Purvises, just as a good reference point. And for a brief few months, It was also the longest vessel on the Great Lakes. This vessel had a carrying capacity of about 1,800 tons, but would often exceed that during its normal runs, as early freighters would generally load as much cargo as possible. So that was a pretty common practice. The Cleveland newspaper, The Plain Dealer, described the vessel as a finer piece of vessel property, never sailed the fresh water. The Cambria left on its maiden voyage for Escanaba, Michigan, as you can see over here in the UP, on June 4th, 1887. It was then to deliver that cargo to Ashtabula, Ohio, which is over here in the red. Thank you. And then it would travel light or without cargo back to Escanaba, and it would keep doing this route repeatedly for 12 years. So then the vessel got shuffled around a lot, or the company that owned it also got shuffled around a lot. So from 1889 to 1923, it changed hands several times. As mentioned in the previous slide, the vessel was originally owned and operated by the Mutual Transportation Company from 1887 to 1899. The company and its assets, which included the Lakeland, was then purchased by the National Steel Corporation of Chicago. In 1901, the National Steel Corporation then merged with several other companies to form the Steel Trust. The Cambria was put under the jurisdiction of the Pittsburgh Steamship Line, a subsidiary of the Steel Trust, and changed its home port from Chicago to Duluth. In 1909, the Cambria was then purchased by the Port Huron and Duluth Steamship Company, and the Cambria spent the winter of 1909 in Milwaukee, where it was converted from a bulk freighter to a passenger and package freighter. So instead of just doing bulk supplies, it would now carry individuals and any of the gifts or supplies or mail that it could carry with it. Also, into 1910 shipping season, it changed its name from the Cambria to the Lakeland. It then served that for 7 years until 1917. The Lakeland was then sold to the Northwestern Steamship Company of Port Huron. A year later, that company went bankrupt, and the assets were then assumed by the Minnesota Loan Trust Company, which couldn't really do anything with it. And then the vessel was sold 2 years after that to two mariners from Cleveland, Ohio, who held on to it for about 1 year. And then in 1920, the Lakeland was sold again to the newly formed Tri-State Steamship Company. So you see it's changing hands several times, or the people who own it get bought out or go bankrupt, and then someone else takes it over. So it's just shifting hands constantly all around the Great Lakes from Lake Michigan up into Lake Superior. The Lakeland was then converted once again into an auto ferry. And so an auto ferry was one that was meant to transport cars, and it could carry about 250 cars at any one time. In 1923, the vessel went under yet another massive overhaul, costing an additional $38,000. All cracks in the frame were repaired, the ballast pumps were repaired, the boiler room was completely replaced, as well as new boilers installed, and the pilot house was also completely replaced. And then later on that same year, in the fall around September, they then fixed the rudder and did a complete inspection of the hull again to make sure that everything was working. And several employees said that it was completely seaworthy and the machinery was completely functioning. In 1924 as well, the Tri-State Steamship Company merged with several other companies owned by the same guy, Mr. Thompson, and then became Thompson Transit Corporation, who was the vessel's owner during the time of the sinking in late 1924. So I kind of went over at the very beginning about what the sinking was like, and I'll get more into the very details of that later. But first I'd like to talk about the actual investigation of the sinking itself. So a week after the sinking, they were filing an insurance claim. And so the insurance claim that was covering it wasn't a singular company. Instead, it was something like 16 different companies, both in the United States and England, that were covering it as portions. So they owned separate bonds as one giant policy. And so they sent an investigator, a lawyer named S.D. Foster, to Sturgeon Bay just to see if everything did sink as they claimed it would. And if they didn't find anything wrong, they would ideally pay out the policy to the owners. And if there was something wrong, they would then conduct further investigations. And initially, in the Door County Advocate, S.D. Foster said that he had no instructions or knowledge of any plan to dispute the insurance claim. The insurance company, though, changed its tune, and a month later, they sent even more investigators to look into the sinkings. They claimed that the vessel could have made it to Sturgeon Bay, or at least onto the beach if they tried to tow the vessel, and that becomes important later. And to be fair, they went in, and the crew of the Cygnus and Ann Arbor No. 6 said that they believed they could have towed the vessel to shore. So there was a legitimate concern to this claim, and it maybe would be something worth investigating. So to conduct a conclusive investigation of the wreck, they had to find the vessel first. You know, if you're going to look into it, you first got to find the thing. The rough location was known about. There were two vessels present, as I mentioned, the Ann Arbor No. 6 and the Cygnus, along with the Coast Guard vessel, but the actual site needed to be dived. And so they needed to attach a buoy to it so they could get a diving platform and get a dive crew to go down and physically investigate the actual vessel itself. Otherwise, it's hearsay with some ships saying that, oh, we could have done it, and the crew saying, no, we really couldn't have done it, and that's not really admissible in court. So they have to hire ships, and they hired 3 separate vessels to try to attach a line to it and then a buoy, and all of them failed. And then they learned the Door County secret. If you want to get it done, you have to hire fishermen. So they hired Kalmbach Fishing Company and Alfred Kalmbach, and they offered him $500 back in that time's currency if they could attach a line to the Lakeland and then a buoy. Mr. Kalmbach said that he would do it, and he would only take the money if he did it successfully. Otherwise, it was just free. So he tried, and after 1.5 turns, he actually successfully attached the cable to the Lakeland, which, mind you, was under 200 feet of water, and got a buoy attached to it. So now they actually had definitive proof where the thing was, and they would be able to then dive it. Here's the thing, though. You have it. You know the location. Who's going to dive it? So they had to reach out to professionals, and they reached out to the Overseas Salvors Incorporated. So this is actually a newspaper clipping I got from the Door County Advocate. They have a really wonderful newspaper archive online, which has their entire collection, and I believe some we've contributed from our Portlight magazines that we have in our collection. And they have a newspaper of the 5 men who were part of the diving team during the Lakeland expedition. Overseas Salvors did agree to do the dive, but they had one condition. They needed someone to lead the team, and they asked for Clarence L. Tibbles. So a little bit about diving. I've done a tiny bit myself when I did an intro class at the YMCA.
You're welcome.
Thank you, work bestie. That was all thanks to Andrea, who actually is a very experienced diver. And she has told me that once you go under 160 feet, things get a bit more complicated. So you can do a normal dive to about 160 feet, but once you go beneath that, you need a special diving mixture of helium and oxygen. And at the time, there wasn't a very reliable way to get that low in diving. Now, it had been done. There were people who set records going down to 300 feet, but not necessarily doing it on a very reliable basis. However, Tibbles was experimenting with how to do that kind of dive on a much more reliable basis, and he agreed, as this would give him an ability to test his ideas on living people. Volunteers, mind you. They didn't know what they were getting into. So they decided then that they were going to dive, so they got a diving platform, and they got recompression chambers on board in case when you rise up too quickly, you can get a condition known as the bends, and a recompression chamber can help you recover back to the normal pressure of above. Because once you go down every 10 meters or so, it's about another G of force. And so rising up really quickly can actually be deadly. So this is how they were able to do it, and they would go down. And by the time you could get to the Lakeland, you only had about 15 minutes. And then you had to slowly start resurfacing again. So they had to go back and forth and back and forth, and months of this to keep going again and again to investigate. The barge itself was called the John W. Chilton. And as I mentioned, they had the recompression chamber on that. The diving operation lasted about 3 weeks, from August 20th to September 11th, 1925. And after the 3 weeks, And the company that hired him spending $60,000 in 1924, or actually 25, thank you. The divers were able to compile evidence, which led to the attorney William Day stating that they found proof that the valves, which could let water in and out of the vessel, were left open, which allowed the Lakeland to sink. They used this argument to not pay the insurance claim. If Thompson Transit Company wanted to pay the payout of the $350,000, they would need to bring them to court. This led to this wonderful sounding law case. Central National Bank Savings and Trust Company et al. Plaintiffs versus Automobile Insurance Company of Hartford et al. Defendants. I know, it just rolls right off the tongue. So there are a total of 2 court cases, one of which we have records for. The first one ended in a stalemate in the, we're gonna have a tie in the court itself, so then they had to do a separate trial again. And we have the records from that one. That one's actually provided by the National Archives in Chicago. About a year, maybe 2 years ago, up at the Death Star Maritime Museum, one of their employees came to me and he said, oh, I have these records on the Lakeland. I can give you the link to them and you can just check them out. And I said, cool. And then I saw them and I thought, this is amazing. I have to write something on this. And here we are. So I went over this. The narrative is like 400 pages and they have a whole lot of different documentation. Anyways. The first court case took place in 1925, and like I mentioned, it ended in stalemate. The second one took place on February 15th, 1926. The plaintiffs, or the people suing the insurance companies, was the Central National Bank Savings and Trust Company. Now, why wasn't it the Thompson Transit Company? Well, it turns out Thompson Transit went bankrupt while waiting for the insurance payment to go out. And this actually becomes pretty vital to the court case that we will be talking about. And the defendant wasn't just the Hartford Automobile Insurance Corporation. They were the representative of those about 16 people or 16 companies that had all those different stakes in that insurance bond. So the insurance claim had 2 sections. One was the vessel itself, which was insured for about $170,000. $180,000 was another contingent, and that was on the vessel being a complete loss. So if the vessel was damaged and inoperable, but you could still use it, you could get the $170,000. But if the whole thing was lost, you'd get $350,000. And so the vessel, though, was insured for a lot of different contingencies. This includes seas and tatter, enemies, pirates, rovers, thieves, fires, explosions, collisions, jettison, barratry of the master of mariners, or basically gross negligence, basically, and all other perils, losses, and misfortunes that may have come or shall come to hurt, detriment, or damage of said vessel or any part thereof. If the insurance companies wanted to deny the claim, they would need to prove that the employees of Thompson Transit Company purposely sank the Lakeland. Otherwise, they were on the line for $350,000. So this was kind of the argument. The defendants were represented by attorneys William Day and T. Catesby Jones. They put forth several key arguments on why they feel the Lakeland was allowed to sink. But before I mention that, I want to kind of go into it a little bit of what they were actually claiming. They weren't claiming that the Lakeland came to Sturgeon Bay with clear instructions that they were supposed to sink it so they could claim the insurance money. What they're claiming is that the vessel was already sinking, and instead of allowing it to be brought back, they then decided there to sink the vessel. So they weren't claiming that this was fraud from the get-go. This was fraud after the sinking started to happen. So this may have been a little bit different if they claimed from the beginning, but they probably wouldn't have had the proof of that. Anyways, the argument included that Thompson Transit Company was heavily in debt. It was in debt for about $250,000. And when the vessel sank, if they could get the full $350,000, they could then get back into the black, and the company could, at least for a little bit, be all right. They claimed that when the divers went down to the wreck site, that they found the seatcocks were wide open, which would allow the water to freely enter the vessel and then allow the sink. And finally, they claimed that the captain, one Captain McNeely, was given for the opportunity to have the vessel towed to shore, and he refused that opportunity, instead allowing it to sink into Lake Michigan. The plaintiffs were represented by attorneys S.H. Holding and Frederick L. Leckie. They claimed that the Lakeland, while leaving Chicago, hit the pier during a storm, which caused a small leak. And once it got to Sturgeon Bay, it then hit an obstruction in the canal while it was waiting out a separate storm, and therefore caused a bigger leak the next day. They argued that Thompson Transit Company, though it was having a rough year, the Lakeland was worth 3 times their next biggest vessel and was by far their most valuable asset. On top of that, it brought in a profit over the last 5 years, 4 of those years. And only the most recent year, it made a small debt, but according to them, the entire shipping industry was doing poorly that year. And so therefore, sinking their most valuable vessel while they were in debt wasn't exactly a great recipe for a successful company. And finally, they claimed there was actually no proof that the Thompson Transit Company purposely ordered the sinking of the vessel. So here is the profits coming from the Lakeland for the Thompson Transit Company. And as showing, over the last 5 years, most of the time, it's making somewhere between $55,000 and $90,000. So close to $50,000 to $100,000 every single year, except for the most recent year, which they claimed was just a poor year overall for the industry. So this wasn't something absolutely unique. Yeah, so it was, the company may have been doing poorly in the past, but if the profits were to be believed, then it is reasonable that in the following years, they could have made back more money and helped save the company. Then there's also the obstruction. So this is obviously the Sturgeon Bay Canal. I recently scanned this photograph, and the main thing that was happening that at the night just before they left, they were coming into here, and then they were coming into the canal itself, and then there's a turning section, and they were going to park starboard on the side of the breakwater here. But somewhere in the middle there, they hit an obstruction. It took about an hour for them to be able to maneuver out of the way of the obstruction itself, and then be able to wait out the rest of the night. Chief Engineer Hidden, the engineer for the vessel, heard a loud thunk and was pretty sure that that was the collision itself, and was aware that they were stuck, but he didn't notice any immediate damages. There was a small leak from before, but this collision didn't seem to do much. The Door County Advocate also reported that there was a small wreck at the mouth of the canal, and it was located by a sounding conducted by government officials. So local newspapers claimed that there was probably something there, and the engineer and the captain both said they hit an obstruction, and they had to do an hour of maneuvering to be able to get out of the way of the obstruction. And later in his testimonies, the captain, McNeely, said that he was fairly confident in his own opinion, which he stressed a lot in his own opinion, that the reason for the sinking was due to this obstruction. He believed that this was probably a rock that they hit, and that it either, A, caused a dent, which meant that it was going to fill with water, but it didn't really start to become a huge issue until they entered into open water, or B, that the rock actually lodged inside of its hull and kind of plugged it up. But then when they moved into open water, the shaking and moving in the open water made it dislodge, and then water started to fill into the hull itself. And he constantly said this was his opinion, as he wasn't really able to prove that this is what happened. The defendants, though, were not convinced by the captain's testimony. According to them, a government survey of the area found that there were no rocks in the area reported where the collision was. Now, this could be that the defendants were right, and that the Lakeland and Captain McNeely didn't really hit a collision, and there was nothing there, and they came up with an excuse that they hit something and that it started to sink out into the water, and this would make up for it. It's also possible that they actually did hit an obstruction, and by hitting it, they moved it out of the way. It could be a rock that they hit and then it just fell over. It could have been a rock that got lodged inside and then brought with them and then dropped. So it's possible that they did hit an obstruction, but the obstruction was no longer there. The big problem with the court case, and as we go into this, is they don't actually disprove anybody during the case. They both say stuff happened, the defendants would say something, the plaintiffs would say something, but they never really cross-examined each other to disprove what the other person said. So basically it was a large shouting match. And so actually figuring out what happened and was someone lying or was someone telling the truth is very difficult. And when looking at historic sources, we have to look for biases and we have to look to see if someone had something to gain from this. And so there is that for sure. But it's not something we can really get a good grasp of, because even in the own court case, over the money that this whole presentation is about, did they ever think to maybe disprove the other person's argument? Instead, they just talked to a bunch of people, and that was that. So, the open seacock, this is important. Chief Engineer Hidden told about the events of the sinking to the court. He testified, said about an hour into their journey, the vessel began to list to port. Now, the vessel was already carrying a large amount of water. The vessel itself was carrying about 50 cars, and this kind of gets a little hazy based on who you ask, but it was around 50. And it could carry around 250 vehicles. So it was carrying 1/5 of its total capacity. But in terms of the amount of weight it could carry, it was carrying about 30 tons and had a max capacity of about 3,500 tons. So it was only carrying about 1% of the total weight it could carry. So it was, as Captain McNeely put it, practically light. So therefore, they had to fill up the ballast with a lot of water, because if it was way too light, it could become very uneasy and the vessel could be very dangerous. So filling it with water could weigh it down and make sure that it was more stable. So it started to list to port. So at first, Hidden opened the ballast tanks on the starboard side of the vessel and tried to fill it with more water. And this was the hope that the vessel would kind of right itself. It would become much more heavier on the starboard side, and then it would start evening out. But this didn't work out. So then he decided to close the ones on the starboard side and instead open up the pumps on the port side, and instead try to pump out the water on the port side instead. Maybe if you made it lighter on one side, it would then even out instead. But not even that was working. The captain then sent a messenger down and noticed that their vessel was indeed leaning to port. And he told him to do so. After he said, "I've already been doing that," he said, "Pump like hell, there is water coming into the cargo hold from somewhere." Before leaving the pumping station, the engineer noted that one of his assistants closed the seacock, which he witnessed and heard, and was adamant that it does make a definitive thunk sound, and so he was absolutely sure that he closed the seacock before he left. And he was dead set on that. The testimony, though, did not line up with the findings of the dive team, who in 1925 found that the seacock was actually completely open. Here's the thing, how do you prove that when it's under 200 feet of water? They didn't have a camera that could work at that depth. In fact, later in 1927, there was a Door County Advocate article that said that someone was trying to experiment with a camera to take a picture of the Lakeland at that depth. So they didn't really have the means to take a picture of the open seacock. They then suggested, well, why don't you just cut off the seacock and bring it up? Well, they had 15 minutes to go down, find the seacock, get the equipment, cut it off, and bring it up with them. And they said, no, that's way too risky. So instead, 3 different divers confirmed that the seacock was open. They sent different people to look down. And they brought their own measuring equipment to see it, and then brought the measuring equipment back up with them and showed them how large it was opening. And this is the proof. And they actually brought the ruler into court and put that into evidence, showing how wide the seacock was when it was open. And as the vessel was sinking itself, the captain did note that the pumps were still going as the vessel was sinking. So they never really shut off the pumps. It just kept doing it, but it kept listening more and more and more to port. And it was getting pretty severe, as we'll talk about in the next slide. So it is possible that someone else did open the seacock beforehand. If there was a nefarious purpose, it could be possible that Chief Engineer Hidden did actually close it. He left, someone came back, reopened it, and then left. It's also possible that Hidden lied and they didn't close the seacock at all. It was just his word. It's also possible that the divers weren't telling the truth. They were getting paid to go down, test out this new idea, and then see if the seacocks were open. And the insurance company may have preferred that the seacocks were open. But because they didn't take the seacock, and I don't blame them, that would have been way too risky to try. They didn't have any photography. They couldn't down and take a picture. And obviously, they weren't going to raise the Lakeland out of the water. That would have been a pretty ridiculous situation, though people have tried similar stuff. And I'll get to that one in the last slide. Those ones make me laugh a bit. There's no real way to prove that the seacock was open or not during that time period. Of course, people did dive the Lakeland. They still dive the Lakeland. And in 2010, the Wisconsin Historical Society went down to the Lakeland and then got it onto the National Register of Historic Places. Fun fact. Okay. So the refusal to tow. You think that, okay, the vessel's going down. And then there are two vessels and a third one on the way. And these are large vessels, vessels that could tow it. And the people on board are offering to tow, and they're confident they could at least tow it to the shore. That why not take them up on their offer, tow the vessel? So this seems the most suspicious. And when you hear the story, the idea of them leaking and about listening to port and about them heading back and then heading towards the vessels that are coming to save them, that could seem somewhat plausible deniability. But the idea that they then refused to save the vessel when both of them were willing, this seems like the sketchiest part. That this was, okay, they sank this for insurance money. It's actually a little more complicated than that. So Captain McNeely sounded off the whistle 4 times, which was the common distress call. And there were 2 vessels in the area that were coming. And he did see the Cygnus in the distance, but at first, he didn't see it move towards them, so he kept heading to shore. But eventually, the Cygnus was heading towards them, and Captain McNeely decided in that moment that his main priority was the crew's lives. He notes in his testimony that he is not related to Mr. Thompson, who owned the company, and he held no stock in the company. So he had no financial incentive, at least publicly, to keep the vessel afloat and therefore the company. Instead, the lives of the people with him took top priority. So he decided, seeing the Cygnus in the distance, it would be better to then turn the vessel around towards the Cygnus, who was coming to their aid, rather than risk trying to make it to shore, where they could then save the vessel and the crew. After getting to the Cygnus, he then drops anchor. Now, he doesn't drop the big anchor, like the big, heavy, 4,000-ton behemoth that could keep it locked. It was the light anchor that they would use when they're in port. And this one was meant to help level out the vessel at least a little bit, because it was listing so much that it was at a 45-degree angle. So people couldn't even walk on the deck anymore. So they needed to get to the lifeboats. And on the port side, it could basically just drop right down. On the starboard side, it was completely to the side, so it couldn't actually get the lifeboat safely. So being able to drop the anchor would be able to then right it just a bit and then get the crew on board to get to the lifeboats. And that's the decision he was making. And as the Ann Arbor number 6 came in, they were then evacuating towards that vessel. But he was the last to leave. Him and about 5 guys. I think him, his first mate, and about 3 other people were the last to leave. And they were looking at the situation and seeing if there was something that could be salvaged. Ann Arbor number 6 offered to tow the vessel. So him and his first mate went to the front of the vessel to try to look down into the hull and see how far the water was getting and if they had enough time to get to their tow line. Their tow line was 3 decks down narrow stairways at a vessel listing to port and water rising. And they saw that in the boiler room, it was about 2/3 full of water. And at that point, they decided there was no way they were then going to risk the lives of the surviving crewmates. No one had died, mind you, but the ones that were there, and to try to get people to come back to then get the cable. The cable was not small. When you think of a tow line today for something, you might think 2-3 inches. This was a foot in diameter. and it was 1,200 feet long. And according to his testimony, it would take about 10 men, 20 to 30 minutes to get it attached. And the ship is sinking, and the water's already rising into the boiler room. So in his mind, there's no way they're going to be able to do this with the 5 guys they have on board. So taking their tow line was out of options. However, the Ann Arbor number 6 had a separate solution. What if we gave you our tow line and you attached it to whatever part of the vessel you can, and we'll tow it to shore? The Lakeland was not designed originally as an auto ferry. It originally was a bulk freighter, but it also was a passenger and package freighter, and it had some pretty nice designs, and it had something called a hurricane deck on board, and it didn't actually have anything close to them that was thick enough to hold the tow line. So in his view, they would have to then risk going down to attach it to something thicker to then tow to shore. So even if it was possible to attach it to something and then tow it to shore, in his mind, the tow line they had was being submerged in water, and it would take 10 men way too much time to attach it to the Ann Arbor number 6 to tow it. So he wasn't going to risk any of that. And they offered to tow it, but there was nothing within reach that was actually thick enough to hold the line together, because it may have just broken off afterwards anyways. So he decided to decline that at that point. He then got into a lifeboat, and him and his remaining men went down and waited for the Coast Guard vessel to come to them. And by the time they got there, the vessel was pretty much gone. He then left onto the Coast Guard boat, asked to go back to the Cygnus, and the remainder of their lifeboats were then strung along with the Cygnus, brought back to Sturgeon Bay, and down to Green Bay. And that was the crew, and the Lakeland was gone. But the way I just pointed out this narrative, this is a very pro-Lakeland way. But there is a little bit of an anti-Lakeland story in there too. See, the thing is that when you are a captain of a vessel, it's basically your responsibility and kind of your property in the sense that you're responsible for it. The thing is, when he got off the vessel, he was still hanging on to the Lakeland itself while on the boat. Therefore, it was still his responsibility. And if he said, you're not going to take the Lakeland, they weren't going to take the Lakeland. They could have tried to do it, to get everything attached to the Lakeland, if he allowed them to. But instead, by hanging on to it and waiting, they didn't have permission. Otherwise, they would basically be stealing the vessel. So therefore, if you think that the Lakeland sank purposefully, it is still very suspicious that a guy who is next to the still above water vessel is hanging on to it and saying, no, don't take it. It's still very suspicious that that's happening. And here's an interesting side bit here. You see the photo here, this is actually of the Lakeland sinking. And the reason we have that is that a crew member on, I can't remember, it was either the Cygnus or the Ann Arbor, was actually taking pictures of the whole thing while it was happening. It didn't sink actually rapidly when they got there. It still took some time. They left at about 7 in the morning, and then they said about an hour in, so about 8 o'clock, they found the leak. And then they got back closer to shore, which is probably about another hour. And then they still had to wait from about 9 until noon until the thing sank. So it still took about 3 hours total. But vessels are coming in, people need to evacuate, they need to be able to right the vessel to evacuate. But as this is happening, a guy's there with the camera and he's watching it as the entire thing is going down. And so we actually have that image for that. Okay. So the Lakeland was reported sinking at 11:30. Afterwards, all crewmen were brought to Sturgeon Bay and dropped off at 12:05. George Boyle and Axel Fredrickson, who were crew members on those ships, both claimed that they were confident that if they were allowed to, they could have towed the Lakeland into Sturgeon Bay. While Captain McNeely feared that the vessel was too far gone to be saved, he wasn't risking anyone's lives for this. The insurance companies did have a different take, though. They believed that by Captain McNeely allowing the vessel to sink, because the Thompson Transit Corporation wouldn't have just gained the $170,000 from the sinking, but because they weren't able to tow it, the vessel would therefore be a complete loss, and then they would owe $350,000, and just so happened conveniently to pay off all the debts of Thompson Transit Company, and then some with an additional $100,000. So that's kind of where the claim was coming in. So here's the defendant's position. Thompson Transit Company had a really bad fiscal year and had lost $18,000 on the Lakeland, as well as losing $250,000 overall for the company. And the insurance was revoked in October because they were in such a bad state, they couldn't actually pay off the insurance claims. And so they had to get more money, pay it off, and the insurance was then later restored. So they were on very, very shaky ground. Lakeland was on its last journey. It had an entire season to make whatever money it could. And then it was leaving with a very, very small shipment of cars, only 1/5 its total. During its final journey, the vessel was, it then went into a storm and waited out in Sturgeon Bay. The next morning, it would leave Sturgeon Bay for Detroit. The Lakeland began to spring a leak. The vessel then turned around back towards Sturgeon Bay and used a common distress call. But here's a little side bit I didn't mention. They had a radio on board. They didn't use the radio. They didn't contact the Coast Guard with the radio. They didn't call to any other vessels with the radio. They just used the steam whistle. So they had the ability to reach out to people, explain the situation, and call for help. They did call for help through common distress, but they didn't try to reach out any other way. When finally it was heading towards Sturgeon Bay, but then suddenly it turned around back into open water, because if it gets too close to Sturgeon Bay and it sinks, it can be in diveable water. But if you're out into the open water, you can get to the point where it suddenly drops off and you get under 200 feet. And like I mentioned before, there was no real reliable way to do that. Sure, someone might be able to dive down far enough to see the Lakeland, but they wouldn't be able to send a crew to routinely investigate it. So they were heading out into deeper water instead of heading towards Sturgeon Bay. And then when they're about to get rescued, they drop anchor and just abandon the vessel. Then the two rescuing vessels both offer to tow the vessel into Sturgeon Bay. And instead, the captain waits, puts his hand on the Lakeland, and waits till it's almost too far gone, and then leaves, and then allowing the vessel to go all the way down. And now suddenly, the very poorly operating company now has $350,000. It saves its fortune, and it can now go on for another day. Here's the plaintiff's position. On the night of December 2nd, while trying to get out of a storm, it hit an obstruction. After maneuvering for an hour, the vessel was able to free itself and wait out the night. The morning before leaving, they checked the full hull for any damage, which they did not find. They left on a course to Detroit, Michigan, but after an hour on a northeastern journey, they started noting that the vessel was starting to list to port. The crew started opening and closing bilge tanks on either side of the vessel, activating its pump, trying to level it out, either trying to take on more water on one side or pump it out the other side. Facing the possibility of sinking, Captain McNeely decided that he would need to turn the vessel back around to Sturgeon Bay, where there they may be able to investigate what is happening with the vessel. The vessel then let out 4 whistle calls, which was a common and well-known sign for distress. The vessel's sideness was in the distance, but showed no signs of answering the distress call. But eventually, it did start to turn. And seeing that his option was to either maybe save the ship and his crew, or probably much more definitely save his crew, he chose the latter option. He then turned around and he went back towards the sideness so he could start evacuating the ship. At the same time, the Ann Arbor number 6 starts heading towards their way, and the Coast Guard is called, and they start sending out a vessel as well. The sideness turns to meet the Lakeland, once they start meeting up, he drops anchor, he tells his men to evacuate the ship, they get off and head over towards the Ann Arbor number 6, which was also arriving in the area. The captain and a few of his men were the only ones to be left behind. Seeing that the situation for towing the vessel was completely hopeless, he decides to abandon ship, he leaves, and he goes to the Coast Guard, who picks them up and brings them into Sturgeon Bay, and the Lakeland goes into the depths of Lake Michigan. So, what was the verdict of this case? And here I have from the Wisconsin Historical Societies, which is a really nice quote, but they say, few facts and other claims testified during the hearings were never directly confirmed or challenged during cross-examination. Rather, individual claims, even when they contradicted other testimony, were generally left to stand on their own merits. As such, the findings in the trial do not clearly resolve many of the nagging questions surrounding the incident. As I said earlier, very little was proven. The jury, though, did rule in favor of the plaintiffs, the bank that owned the Lakeland. They were now owed not just the $170,000, which that was the only thing they were looking for, and even claimed several times that they don't know why this is being a case, as they're not asking for the full $350,000, only the vessel's cost. But now they were owed the additional $180,000, and not just that, they were also owed the accrued interest because they didn't pay out right away. So the insurance company did what any good insurance company would do. They appealed the decision, and they lost. And then they decided enough was enough, and they appealed the second time. And they actually won that appeal. They decided that the judge did not instruct the jury well enough during their deliberation. But this doesn't mean they were off the hook. It meant that they would have to go for a third trial. But this isn't in the paperwork anymore. It's not in the advocate. It's not in the National Archive records. We don't have a record of what really happened. So it's probably assumed that they decided to meet and settle out of court at this point. Because going through another trial means you have to get all the jurors, you had to get a new jury, you had to get a new court, you had to get a whole new, you had to get all the witnesses that they have talked over for, I believe, 6 days of testimony, and then they may not win. So they just most likely assumed that it was better to get the money that they could get rather than try to risk it and do this all over again. So I'm thinking, and this is more my personal opinion, they accepted something closer to what they were actually looking for, which was the $170,000 for the vessel. But I don't really have any proof on that. That's more of a hunch because that's what they claimed throughout the trial is what they were really looking for. Yeah. So if anyone has any proof of what happened at the end of the trial, please email it to bchristianson@dcmm.org. I'd love to get in touch with you and add on to the story. But let's talk about the Lakeland today. So it's been about 100 years since the sinking of the Lakeland, and that's why I decided to write this along with the sources I found. There have been several attempts to dive the vessel since that point. If you have the ability to dive it, meaning you have the special tech certification, and over here, this is actually a kind of a scan of the vessel itself as the Wisconsin Historical Society dived it in 2014. People have dived since that time. People have also tried to do some pretty interesting stuff with the vessel. This one actually I found in a Door County Advocate article from 1963, and is that people were really interested in the cars. The automobiles they were carrying were called Kissel cars, and it's a company that doesn't exist anymore. It's a very rare vehicle. People wanted to take this and bring it up and show this off. And from the 60s to the 80s, and this is a whole separate presentation that I've given, that the diving clubs in Door County were these short-lived, not like modern diving clubs, mind you. I don't want to associate with modern diving clubs that are recreational divers. These were clubs that were very short-lived operations in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they would go out and they would generally salvage shipwrecks. And they would take small things from coins and plates and such like that to large things like rudders and anchors. If you drive up and down Door County, if you look out on our front lawn, we got a whole bunch from them out there. And our museum has stuff from these diving clubs. They even raise whole vessels. If you've heard of the Elvin Clark, that was kind of the most famous example or maybe infamous example of what they've done. They would do this. And so the Lakeland was no exception. The problem is the Lakeland is very deep. It's very hard to do it. So they decide, wait a minute, what if for the sake of argument, the Lakeland wasn't in such deep water. What if maybe the Lakeland was in more about 100 feet of water, in which case we would be able to dive it and get at these really nice special cars. So how do we do that? Well, this was in 63. The Jenabelle, which was attempted to be raised in 61, failed miserably. The whole thing snapped in half and went down. And the Elvin Clark was in 69. And that's when they actually successfully raised the whole vessel. But that was a wooden schooner. This is a freighter, different level of stuff. So they decide, we're not going to be able to go down and be able to, get a bunch of loops on it. And that would be very expensive to be able to raise the whole vessel. It's been down there for decades. We don't know what condition it's in. And unlike wood, which may keep its shape, this may be rusty and it may be a lot more fragile. So instead, they decide to hire a tugboat, attach a line to the bow, and literally drag it into shallow water, which kind of worked at first. They actually were able to move it a couple feet the first time. And that didn't work well. It wasn't budging after that point. So the next year they came back. And the John Purvis itself, our own tugboat, was hired to move it more. And they attached a line to something under 200 feet of water with the hope of dragging it into shallow water to get at antique cars. I'm getting livid thinking about it. What happened, though, is the first time it actually dragged it into a more secure position, so it wasn't going anywhere. And after 3 hours of trying to move the vessel, they decided to give up. And so they decided, that's done. We're not doing that. We're not going to be able to drag an entire freighter into shallow water. So instead, later on, these two men right here, Kent Bell Richard and Robert Asno. And Kent Bell Richard is still alive, but Robert Asno passed away several years ago. And his son, we got in contact, Stephen Asno. The reason I bring that up is that steam whistle is about 10, 15 feet from me, just over that way. You go to the Jim Crest Maritime Lighthouse Tower on our second floor of the shipwrecks. We actually have the steam whistle from the Lakeland, which is on loan from the Asno family. So if you're interested in seeing it, come to the museum. Open Thursday to Monday until April, and in May it's 7 days a week. They went down to actually get one of the cars. And the thing is that the car raising didn't go successfully. So as I mentioned before, humans, when they go up, have to go very gradually because of the pressure. But even if you're bringing objects up, you're still bringing it up through a bunch of pressure. And what happened is they raised it, and apparently they kind of dragged it a bit. But as they did, it smashed the vehicle. And so it got up, and then they put it in a landfill because the vessel was just crushed completely from the raising. And that's one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of the historic diving clubs, because many times they're not done very well. Anyways, so interesting history though. Anyways, they were able to raise the actual steam whistle itself, and we do also have some pottery and stuff like that from the vessel as well. So it's kind of an interesting one there. In 2010, the Lakeland was added onto the National Register of Historic Places. And after a group of people from the Wisconsin Historical Society went down, they took this picture. Many of the graphics of the modern Lakeland today is from those dives. And I'm very grateful for all the information they compiled. And they actually compiled a massive document which had a lot of this narrative in it. And they also led me to other sources so I could do this research. So thank you, Tamara Thompson and the Wisconsin Historical Society. You're the best. Anyways, so the legacy of the Lakeland. It doesn't lie with its 37-year history plying the waters of the Midwest, transporting iron, coal, passengers, and even vehicles. Nor is it known for its short time as the largest bulk freighter of the Great Lakes. Rather, despite having no evidence to support the narrative of a fraudulent sinking, the Lakeland today is remembered as possibly Door County's most infamous example of insurance fraud. Thank you. So I just wanted to point out some of the sources here. So as I mentioned, Wisconsin Historical Society did put a report together. It's called With Waves in Their Wake, Underwater Archaeological Investigations from 2013 Field Season. If you actually just look up that title online, you'll find the document online. It's free to access. Really interesting. It goes over 2 other shipwrecks, but the main one is on the Lakeland. They go over its history, the court case, and then their own divings of the site itself. But I am not an underwater archaeologist, so I kind of get lost after the narrative part. Also, the the National Archives in Chicago has a digital archives, and I was given a link to it. It is free to access to the public. It is under the very large name Central National Bank Savings Trust Company, et cetera, et cetera. But you can go there and you can find about 400 pages of testimony along with exhibits that were given for the court case itself, and this is for the second court case that they did. And then also, if you go online and just look up Door County Advocate Archive, or Sturgeon Bay Newspaper Archive, or Door County Newspaper Archive, it'll send you to a link that is a server owned by the library of Door County, and they have a copy of basically every single, as far as I know, Door County Advocate newspaper, as well as several of the smaller newspaper, like the small political ones like the Republican and the Democrat, and also the Port Light, which was one that was just run for Latham D. Smith Shipbuilding Company. Very interesting one. And you can even look up search terms like Lakeland, and it will just send to every single instance they have of that in their entire collection. Very useful for research. I used them several times. It's a great resource. So, questions? Yes.
Is it still okay for divers to pull things off shipwrecks?
Absolutely not. Thank you for asking, wonderful person in the back there. Yeah, so in 1987, the National Shipwrecks Act gave control of shipwrecked artifacts to the state or tribal government in which the water lies. The state had been trying since the 60s to limit that. Scuba was becoming pretty brand new, and it was becoming available to the public in the early 60s. And they would then go to Admiralty, and the Admiralty law would consider it salvageable because it would just be goods that were no longer in commerce. And so people got salvage rights. They went over to the state government because the federal government said it was okay. In 87, they said, we're not doing that anymore. They hand it back to the states, and the states have been very, very adamant that you do not take stuff from shipwrecks. Yes?
What if you just find a whole shipwreck? Can I just take a whole shipwreck off the beach?
Not only is that a not legal thing you can do, that is also a pretty ill-advised thing that you can do.
Who should I call, Brennan?
You should call the Wisconsin Historical Society if you find shipwreck material, or if you contact us, we will send it to them and they will contact you as well. They're very wonderful. Yes?
Have any of the more recent dives to the wreck proved or disproved whether the valves were left open?
I actually don't know. That may be something to look at, but I mentioned that I'm not an underwater archaeologist, so I didn't take a look at that further section, but it might actually be in the report itself. I can take a look at that, but I imagine that would be your best place to figure out.
It might be under the soil.
Yeah, it might be under the soil, but also
At
even
this
if...
point, it's going to be an issue of mussels also. It would be really, really hard to see any sort of like fine detail structure because those mussels make everything really, really fuzzy.
Even at 200 feet.
Yeah.
And even if it was open, that doesn't prove that they purposely left it open. It could have been any number of reasons that it is open today, but I would suggest going to the report. That would probably be the best way to look for it, because doing tech dives are extremely difficult, and anyone who could do that kind of report would be from the Wisconsin Historical Society. Okay. Yes?
How did Kalmbach hook up the initial line?
I'm not exactly sure, because this was done through the advocate. So the advocate just said that he did 1.5 turns. I would imagine that he would have weighted a line down and then kind of dragged it around until it attached to a surface at that level. But I'm not exactly sure, because it was done from the back from one of his fishing boats, though. So think of the technology at the time. I'm thinking that would be the best one. But the advocate didn't go into great detail of how it was accomplished, just that it was accomplished.
Do you think when the purpose was towing it, moving it, it caused it to break the way it did?
I don't think so. I think after falling for the 200 feet, it probably did once it hit it. It's also possible when the first vessel tugged it as well, it may have just tugged the front part and maybe left it a bit disjointed. I don't think, because it seemed like when the Purvis was doing the towing, it was already snug in position. So I don't think it would have broken it apart. Plus, it wasn't just a clean break. It was kind of off on the side like that already. So, yeah.
I was gonna say, the 4 other people that were on the boat that originally found it, the fishing boat, are those listed, those 4 other people?
Sorry, repeat the question?
There was 5 people on the boat, the fishing boat that found it.
Oh, you mean the
Attached to
dive
buoys,
team?
the dive team?
Yeah.
Did the advocate say who the other 4 were? By chance?
The advocate didn't, but it is in the report itself. I didn't write down their names specifically, but they all were experienced divers who worked for the, I can't remember what the name of the company was.
The reason I asked is the young kid growing up here, I remember there's a guy by the name of Franny Fellifer. Maybe some people who live here, he just died a few months ago, 6 months ago, Franny did, his dad was Frank. He always told us as a kid that he was on the team that went down to.
I mean, the site was dived in 1924,
Yeah.
and so these were all adults, so it wouldn't have been him just because of the age.
Died, the other, yeah, I wouldn't.
He was on it in the 60s.
Yeah, other people, you said he was there in the 60s? He's saying that they dived it in the 60s.
Oh, in the
So,
60s.
yeah, because people did dive it after the point. Yeah, but he
So he wasn't on the original.
He wasn't on the original team, but he
Later one.
probably would have been on the later. Yeah.
I was surprised that you didn't have the picture of the cars actually on the ship underwater.
Yeah, that's actually the reason I didn't do that, and this is me totally covering for myself right now, is that if you actually go into the exhibit, we have the pictures of that there. And so if you come here and pay for admission to see it, you can see the cars under the water. I work here for a living, sir.
We don't do freebies at the Maritime Kingdom.
If you go to the Wisconsin Historical Society website and look up Lakeland, all the pictures are available on there, including the cars that are under the water.
I'm gonna let you show that picture.
This is totally not me just covering for the fact that I didn't think to put that up there. Anyway.
So there's no records of the final settlement because that was a private matter?
Yeah, that was a private matter. And I've done another legal paper. Last year I did one on the Linda E. and I couldn't find anything about that private settlement either, just that there was a private settlement. But this one is even more strange because they don't even mention it at all.
There's no corporate records from?
Nothing that I can find. I mean, this was all the way back in the 1920s. It's possible that this was kept really hush-hush, or it might be in an archive that's not in Wisconsin. This might be over in Ohio where a lot of the companies were, in which case I would need to go to Cleveland and get a travel budget for something that might not be there, so.
Do any of my Sea Scouts have questions? Nope. Okay, we'll do one more question from the crowd and then we're gonna wrap it up because like I said, y'all, it's been a real long week.
Yes, sir.
In the testimony, obviously it sank from water, and you indicated the water was going into the cargo. It wouldn't have sank from water and valve tanks, because that's what valve tanks do with cold water. Did they ever question any of the crew members as to how the water was getting into the cargoes?
Okay, that's actually a really interesting point, and I can bring up one last little thing here. So Captain McNeely and Chief Engineer Hidden were actually, when a vessel goes down, they had to go to the Steamship Inspection Service, one of the precursors of the Coast Guard, and give their testimony, either write it down or go in person and say what they were doing to talk about the shipwreck itself. And when they did, they got a letter saying that they were going to suspend their license for gross negligence. And so they could refute this. They could go to court and ask for a trial for that. And when they gave their final thing, they said that it was gross negligence, that once colliding with something, you didn't do a further investigation into it to see if there was something, like some kind of broken ballast tank or some kind of thing in the hull, and that you didn't check the water levels until an hour into the voyage itself and started noticing it was going to port. And once that was happening, you didn't put any real effort in trying to find the leak or anything there. So basically, they thought that this was too negligent for a captain to do, and he got his license suspended for a year. So this was actually brought up in a court case about that. And they did talk to everyone on board the vessel that they could get for the trial itself.
And the chief was not held accountable?
Well, he was suspended, but he wasn't, I don't think there was any criminal proceedings after that. In fact, he remained on the payroll of Thompson Transit while his license was suspended, which is another one of those kind of iffy things about saying like, oh, the guy who crashed it is still on the payroll somehow and he has no license to help the company. Ooh. Anyways, thank you. I'll remain here if anyone has any more questions, but thank you. Don't forget to come next month to hear about the stone industry in Door County.
Yes, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Everybody have a safe trip home.
I would have stopped by for gas today, but it's a little cold.